thank you all for being here. As many of you know, my name is Jaymee Maddock. I am a legal research consultant. I've worked for some years on the issue of freedom of speech, which is near and dear to my heart, and on civil liberties and freedom movement more generally over the last few years. I'm joined today by Jaymee J, who has, we've done a number of podcasts together under the brand The Corruption Files on YouTube. And this is our fourth podcast together, but Jaymee's been far more prolific than I have over the years. She's done, I believe, over 50 podcasts on a variety of topics. Would you like to introduce yourself, Jaymee?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay. My background is actually in mental health, and so I'm a real... I research a lot on abuse and power and control and dynamics like that stuff, and so I guess my interest getting into the political arena is kind of focusing on that sort of stuff, coming from that perspective, sort of the sociology, the psychology of it, and kind of some of these underlying dynamics that I see mirrored in interpersonal relationships, and so that's sort of where I'm coming from this. Otherwise, I'm mostly just an advocate for individual freedom and autonomy of the individual, so I don't normally get involved in political parties or things like that. I normally try to just work with people one-on-one, but Jaymee invited me on today because some people find it interesting to sort of have us contrasting those two views for podcasts, because I think it's really mirrored the individual and the political. So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. So the topic today, as a lot of you know, is a new piece of legislation being proposed called the Online Harms Act. And this does touch on the whole issue of abuse and of power dynamics. And of course, the value proposition here, or the government's stated objective, is to make the internet safer. They even say on their Government of Canada website, and I quote, "Everyone in Canada should be able to access an online environment where they can express themselves freely, without fear for their safety or their life." And then they list a number of things that they're doing with this new legislation. And it's really what's called an omnibus bill. There's a bunch of unrelated things all being thrown into one law. For example, they will mandate online platforms, including live stream and user-uploaded services, to adopt measures that reduce the risk of harm, such as in content that sexually victimizes children or re-victimizes a survivor, or is intimate, posted without consent, and non-compliance results in strict penalties. Now, of course, online platforms can and should moderate these kinds of abusive forms of content, and they do, and the criminal code prevents things like child porn from being accessed and uploaded. But those provisions haven't had 100% success in preventing all criminal content, so the current liberal, and I use that term loosely because they're not ideologically liberal, Justin Trudeau's idea is to bring in more government, and that government can protect people. Government can protect people from their abusers. Government can protect people from themselves. And that's sort of the ideology behind this. Can you comment on that, Jaymee, just from what you've seen? Is that, does big government solve these kinds of problems?
Yeah, it seems like they always try to sell themselves as a protector, and that we can sort of abdicate our own personal responsibility over to government, and that they'll take this sort of parental role in keeping us safe, which is just basically as long as we stay in an infantile role and expect somebody else to keep us safe, then we're going to give over some of our autonomy in order to trade it for this safety. And the way that I see things right now is I think a lot of these measures sound really good because they're sort of, using your empathy and your virtue and your desire to have those things that they're selling the bill for, like, safety from harm, people not being exploited. These are all things that we all can agree that are things that we want. However, the government acting like they can provide those things to us by restricting and censoring things doesn't make sense at all. It's not even possible, but it's also futile at this point, I think, to think that that's going to somehow, first of all, I don't think it's even going to work. Like, even if they were going to pass these laws, people always find a way around. I mean, there's a dark web, there's writing laws against immorality has never stopped immorality. It just makes immorality go more underground and makes people be more creative in ways that they can do it. That actually makes people less safe, in my opinion. So even though these things sound really good, and a lot of people with good virtues and good hearts who care about children and don't want people to be exploited are going to say, yeah, that sounds great. I'd like to be protected. I'd like to be safe, but that's just not the reality of how these things are working. And I think at this time we need to wise up a little bit to that and realize that the only way that we're actually going to get beyond these things is to actually become more moral people ourselves voluntarily of our own free will. And to promote other people to do that and to provide avenues and education for people to know how to do that, want to do that, and supporting people in doing that. It's never going to be something that the government's going to do to us by being our parent.
Yeah, and using the term by our parent, it does seem here like they're usurping the role of the family. For example, they're implementing safety measures tailored for children and implementing other measures to reduce exposure to 7 categories of harmful content, including content that involves bullying or promotes self-harm among young people. Well, that seems like an area where parents have to step up. It seems like an area where families and communities have to step up. And children do access the internet, will access the internet. It doesn't seem like a digital safety commissioner, and I'm going to introduce that concept in a moment, but it doesn't seem like that person is going to know the children or know the dynamic that goes on between children. So there is obviously a risk of abuse, but that's something that's so localized and so it involves individuals. It doesn't just involve a one-size-fits-all solution. But nevertheless, what the government suggests we do is establish a digital safety commission to oversee and enforce the regulatory framework. And I quote from the law here, Section 12 of the Online Harms Act says, the commission consists of 3 to 5 full-time members to be appointed by the governor and council to hold office during good behavior. The governor and council may remove a member for cause. So when we hear the governor and council, that's a person who, that's basically the government. It's the cabinet with the prime minister at the head of the table. So as long as the prime minister has the control of his party and the control of the cabinet, he can determine what good behavior means on behalf of the digital safety commissioner. He can appoint digital safety commissioners who he considers them to be of good behavior, and he can remove digital safety commissioners when he considers them to be of bad behavior. So the whole idea of a commission separate from government is supposed to create an illusion of a process that's independent from politics, right? There's a commissioner. It's not a politician, it's a commissioner. But as a practical matter, these commissioners can be hired and fired by the government at will, for political reason, or for any reason, or for no reason. What's your thoughts on that, Jaymee, as a process?
For arbitrary reasons that are going to be defined by the person in power, just like these terms are being defined, the meaning of words is being defined, like you said, a good or a bad position, they can be fired. Well, who defines that? What does that mean? Who has the power to decide what that means? And can that change over time? Can it mean one thing at one time and then mean something else at a later time, depending on what the person with the power arbitrarily decides that means at any point in time? That doesn't feel very safe to me.
No, good behavior is an inherently subjective term, for sure. Another thing, and perhaps the most troubling from a political speech perspective, is the changes to the hate speech regulations under the Canadian Human Rights Act. And they're bringing back a piece of legislation that I want to go into a little bit. It's called Section 13(1) of the Human Rights Act. And the way it's phrased in the new bill is it's a little bit different than it was before, but it's an old piece of legislation that's been around since the 1980s. And it says, it is a discriminatory practice to communicate or cause to be communicated hate speech by means of, it used to say by means of a telecommunication undertaking, but it now says by means of the internet or any other means of telecommunication, in a context in which hate speech is likely to foment detestation or vilification of an individual or group of individuals on the basis of a prohibited ground of discrimination. So they've got these, it's a little bit different. The old one said likely to expose a person or persons to hatred or contempt, which could mean almost anything. Now they're saying detestation or vilification. Well, vilification is a concept, I guess, in literature. If you have an antagonist in a book, you might vilify that person in the sense of showing something about their character or spinning a narrative. Like, it is part of narrative. And sometimes there are people who do wrong who need to be vilified for whatever reason. But this idea that you can't vilify somebody, any thoughts on that, or how that plays into to what you just said about subjective versus objective?
I just can't believe in 2024 that I even have to state as obvious that I don't think that anybody has the right to write any type of law or prohibit what anybody can think or feel or love or hate or vilify or any opinion somebody could have. I understand crime. A crime is a crime. It doesn't really matter what you're feeling or thinking when you do it, in my opinion. It's what you actually do, right? And so the example that I use is somebody such as a pedophile, and that word actually means, philia actually means love, not hate. So they can define that as love and not be able to be vilified for that. And if I say anything about that, then I'm the hateful one. To me, it doesn't matter how somebody feels. If you're harming a child, that's a crime. It doesn't matter if you feel like you love them or you hate them. It's the actual act itself that is immoral. What happens internally inside of a person is their own private property. And not only does the government not own us as having ownership over our body and our person, but I mean, to have control and write laws over our thoughts and our emotions and our opinions and how we can feel about anything is absolutely ludicrous, that I can't even believe it's like up for debate that any person outside of myself could write anything telling me what I could think or feel inside of myself. If I do something based on that to somebody else, that's a different story. But for somebody to actually think that there's any legitimacy to legislating hate or vilification or any of these things is, I can't even believe it's not so obvious. I think we've been so conditioned to actually not even know our own authority over ourselves. And I think that these laws, they're going to just keep writing them and writing them and writing them until people recognize that and recognize the illegitimacy of them and don't even entertain them at all.
Yeah, well said. And I think that is a process that I witnessed happening back in 2008 with this same section, Section 13.1 of the Human Rights Act, when it was in force. And it had been in force for a while. It was initially targeted at these telephone answering machine hate lines where people would record a hateful message and people would call in and listen to it. And it was applied to the internet. It never anticipated the internet, but it got applied to the internet. And people didn't notice that for a long time, but it was used by a gentleman by the name of Richard Warman, who became very well known in kind of free speech circles as somebody who was maybe a little overzealous. I'm being careful. I'm trying to be fair to the man here, but a little overzealous in the way that he did his job, because he worked for the Canadian Human Rights Commission at the time, and there was this law, the hate speech law, likely to expose a person or persons to hatred or contempt. And what Mr. Warman would do is he would go online to some of these very fringe internet forums, like I'm talking neo-Nazi kind of places, and he would post things, oh, what do you think about the Jews? Or what do you think about the blacks? And he would post those kinds of things, and he'd get a deluge of sometimes pretty foul responses. And then he would do a little cyber sleuthing, figure out who these people were, sue them, destroy their lives, and take large monetary judgments from them. And this was his little hobby while he was working for the Human Rights Commission of Canada. None of this is controversial, it's a known fact. And it was, but it was not that well known at the time when he was doing it. And he, frankly, a lot of people had their reputations and their careers destroyed, and it cost them a lot of money to be on the receiving end of this kind of litigation that was really just brought by one man. And at the time, in 2008, there was, I think there were around 20 or 30 different prosecutions under the Human Rights Act, this section, and almost all of them had been brought by Mr. Warman, and there was a 100% conviction rate. Every single person who was ever charged was convicted and fined. And most of the people who were convicted and fined were pretty marginal. They were neo-Nazis. A lot of them were a little bit crazy, but it was something that just kind of went under the radar and went without notice. Nobody at the Human Rights Commission or the government really cared that Mr. Warman was doing this. And he didn't have to prosecute the complaints by himself, by the way. It was he would file the initial complaint, but the Human Rights Commissioner would appoint a lawyer who would then go and prosecute it, and then it would go before a tribunal, and then they would issue a judgment against the person and either seize their wages or take their house or whatever. And there was a substantial number of these cases that went through. Now, the time that things started to turn around, the tide started to turn around, and people realized, maybe this legislation isn't the best, was in 2008. Maclean's magazine, which I'm sure everybody here knows, a very mainstream Canadian magazine with a long history, published an excerpt from a book called America Alone, The End of the World as We Know It. And it was a New York Times bestseller. It talked about immigration levels to the West from Islamic countries and the consequences of that. But it wasn't hate speech. It was quite a humorous kind of satirical, but also serious in its political message, and about the consequences of immigration, the consequences of religion, the consequences of diversity, and controversial stuff, but not so controversial that Maclean's magazine wouldn't print it, not so controversial that it wasn't a New York Times bestseller. And so Maclean's magazine was sued for that. Of course, published about it. Why are we being sued? We're the media. We should have free speech. Around the same time, Ezra Levant, who many will know as the founder of Rebel News, was running a newspaper called the Western Standard, and he was the only publisher in Canada to publish the cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, which were very controversial at the time. The CBC News blurred them out and censored them, and the National Post and Globe and Mail wouldn't publish them. Western Standard did publish all of them and said, here's what the fuss is all about. Here's what people are being killed for in Europe. Look at them, Canada. Make up your own mind. And an imam in Calgary filed a complaint against Mr. Levant. He was dragged in before the Human Rights Commission and interrogated about his intention when he published these cartoons. He was defiant as well, put out a blog about it, published a lot of stuff, and a huge debate took place. The mainstream media widely panned Section 13 of the Human Rights Act, said, we're all being censored now. How can we have this? How can our media be not allowed to publish controversial material? And it got to the point where even the Toronto Star said, this is ridiculous. This needs to be repealed. That debate went on up and down for a few years. And in 2013, at long last, Stephen Harper's Conservative government decided that it was time to repeal Section 13. They got rid of it. They got it off the books. And that was a happy day for me after fighting for 5 years to try to repeal this pernicious piece of legislation to finally see it gone. But how quickly people can forget, how quickly this turning of the tides that happened in between 2008 and 2013 can just go back to the status quo. And Justin Trudeau's Liberal government quietly slides the same piece of legislation into a new bill and uses the premise of protecting children from online bullying as a basis to bring back censorship of the mainstream media. It just seems so dishonest to me. What do you think, Jaymee?
I've always agreed with the statement that the solution to wrong speech is more speech. So if somebody is incorrect in what they're saying, right, wrong, hate, immoral, any speech that has anything wrong with it, I believe the way to work that out is to have more speech about it and for it to be public and exposed and engaged in dialogue and have more information presented and for things to be public. I don't see how keeping information from people protects them in any way. I don't see how paying out a bunch of money or being more sneaky about where people talk about things protects anybody from anything in any way. I think personally, I feel much safer knowing the reality of the world I live in and also knowing the truth of what people are talking about, what they think, because then I can actually make decisions on how to interact with somebody when I'm fully aware of what they think and feel. And I'm a huge advocate for free speech, even for my worst enemy, even for the people who I think think have the worst ideas that I would not agree with any of them. I want them to have a web page that I can personally go and access and look at and read their literature and see what they think, so that I can understand them, so that I can understand why they're thinking the way they are, so that I can come up with ideas of how I might be able to change the way they think if I think that it's incorrect or immoral, or that they have the wrong information, or that their ideas are somehow going to be harmful or dangerous. I want to be able to talk to those people. I want to be able to influence, but I can't do that if they're underground hiding, pretending they're something they're not, because they're scared of getting in trouble from the government.
Yeah, it's a really terrifying moment when we can't have honest conversations. We can't confront those who we disagree with, and it can drive people underground. It can make people afraid to speak, including people with good ideas. Just because this legislation is aimed at bad ideas doesn't mean that it will never be, it won't flip on a dime, and it won't be going after good ideas next year. So just to sum up what I'm concerned about, there's a perverse incentive here to be offended. People who are offended, like Mr. Warman, who I just mentioned, or like the students who sued Maclean's magazine, or the imam who sued Western Standard and Ezra Levant, these are people who had a financial motive to pursue a legal process. And some of them did, not so much the ones who went after Maclean's, but Maclean's then had to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars defending itself. So there's a financial disincentive to publish controversial material, even for a big magazine like Maclean's. Think about the ordinary little publisher, the ordinary blogger or YouTuber, being afraid of getting a human rights complaint. That could really put a chill on freedom of expression, because anybody really can be offended at any time for any reason, and completely invalid reasons. And then meanwhile, when the individual who's the complainant has the entire machinery of the state at their behest, the individual who's the defendant, they're not facing jail. You don't go to jail for civil human rights disputes because it's individual on individual. It's not the state on an individual. And so the individual who's facing a massive fine but not jail doesn't get legal aid. So they could be poor, they could have no knowledge of the legal system. They might not even know how to read and write, frankly, or might be very poor at reading and writing, as many of the unsophisticated defendants to these kinds of actions are. And they don't get any legal representation. And they might those who are afraid will quit speaking. So there's a real concern there about the chilling effect and the complete neutralizing conversations, legitimate conversations, difficult conversations that society has to have. Also, truth. That's another big problem with Section 13 of the Human Rights Act. Truth is not a defense. So you could say a totally true thing about immigration statistics, for example, and immigration and crime is an example that people use. You could say something totally true about that, and if it tends to vilify a group, you could be banned from the internet and fined, even if it's totally true. Honestly held religious belief is another one. You could say something about your interpretation of the Bible or your interpretation of the Quran. If it offends somebody based on their sexuality, for example, that could be a human rights complaint, even if it's completely anchored in Scripture, even if it's completely a fair description of the Scriptures of your faith, you could still be punished for that. So it takes true conversation and honest religious dialogue off the table and punishes people for engaging in those kinds of conversations, which I find really, really quite terrifying. So one thing that I'm going to suggest is, for those of you who are here tonight, you obviously care about this issue. Jonathan mentioned that I'm teaching a course on this subject matter. So that's something that's going to be happening next week here at arrive around 6:30. And anybody who wants to, I can tell that Foxy is interested. Anybody who wants to come to that course, I would really appreciate filling you all in on sort of the background, the more legalistic background of how we got here, what we can do about it. But I can give you one thing you can do about it right now on your way out is there's a letter writing campaign. I've put together a letter to some of the members of the Committee on Justice and Human Rights. And this is the group that has to analyze this legislation and parse it and make changes to it. It's not too late to change it. It's not too late to play around with it and apply pressure. So the letter that I've written is to the conservative members, the opposition members of that committee, urging them, reminding them of what happened with Maclean's magazine, and urging them to fight back and be a real opposition. So if you are interested in pushing for that, just you can sign the letter on your way out with your name and address, and that's would be very helpful. So that's something that you guys can do. We're going to open it up to questions in a minute, but is anything you want to say in conclusion, Jaymee?
I just wanted to kind of bring up the idea of what safety actually is. You know, like, I don't know if anybody's, you know, lived with an abusive person or had an abusive employer or something, you know, that feeling where you're just always walking around on eggshells and never sure if you're doing, you know, what you should be doing, and, you know, always kind of watching what you say and asking permission for everything. And I mean, it's a really horrible place for a human being to be in. I mean, we're wired to be freedom oriented animals and to be autonomous and to, you know, be able to make decisions for ourselves. And when we have all the facts, you know, around us and we know what reality is, we are actually so much stronger and able to be resilient and deal with so many things if we know what we're dealing with, you know. Most of the time that we have trauma, it's because we don't know what's going to happen, you know. If you get some diagnosis from the doctor, or you don't know what's going to happen with the economy, or it's that kind of not knowing what's coming at you that's really puts us in a, you know, in a state of insecurity and not feeling safe. But when things are happening, we can normally deal with them if we know what we're dealing with, you know. I've always thought that. And when people think that they're going to be safe by putting a bunch of rules and controlling everybody else and controlling everything around them, and, you know, if they could just put everything a certain way, then they'll feel safe. I mean, to me, that feels like the most unsafe place that I'd ever want to be in, personally. And I just kind of want to leave you guys with that thought and think, you know, I'm not sure what this safety is that people think they can find through censorship and controlling other people and making all these rules. And, you know, I feel that for me, when I think about feeling safe, I think about feeling safe knowing that everybody around me has all the information that they need, that they're doing what they really want to do, that they're saying and thinking what they really want to say and think, and that they're communicating how they really feel. To me, that is like, that's how I envision safety, and that's what I want for myself and everybody else.
Thank you. I think that is a free society is a safe society, and if we would sacrifice our freedom for safety, we deserve neither, and we usually get neither, as we see from every authoritarian regime that's ever existed on this planet. So with that, I'll open it up to questions. Does anybody have any questions, comments, thoughts? And there's a microphone going around for anybody who wants to speak out. Yes.
Forgive me that I haven't researched further into this, but the Online Harms Act, how far-reaching is that? Could a Canadian citizen, should it get very oppressive here, could they conduct a conversation in a platform that's hosted in another country where perhaps more free speech is permitted? Or is this Online Harms Act tied to your citizenship in Canada, no matter where you go in the world, to try to get word out of what's going on the inside?
So Section 13 of the Human Rights Act, which I mentioned, is specific to Canadian citizens. They can't sue an American, for example, because Americans do have the First Amendment. They can't have a piece of legislation like this in America. However, social media companies in America and other countries want access to the Canadian market, and they need to use Canadian telecommunications infrastructure. So if a company like YouTube, for example, received a notice under this piece of legislation, remove this person, ban this person, the Canadian government asks you that this person has to get booted off your platform, or you get a massive fine, and if you want to keep using Canadian telecommunications infrastructure, you're going to pay for it in millions of dollars. Guess what YouTube or Facebook or probably even Twitter is, what are they going to have to do? They're going to have to boot that user off. That's just simple math from their perspective. They want access to the Canadian market. And social media companies do that all the time. In Germany, for example, there's laws there, very strict laws against Holocaust denial. And if somebody, which it's completely legal in the United States to deny the Holocaust, but if somebody goes on Facebook, German Facebook, and denies the Holocaust, guess what Facebook is going to do? They're going to ban that person. So the same is going to go, I think, with Canada when you have something like, publishing a controversial book or publishing a controversial opinion that gets a complaint. You are going to see social media companies playing along with the Canadian government as just a business decision, as a matter of economics. And that is part of the chill on freedom of speech. Maybe there will be small platforms or underground platforms or dark web platforms where people can say really nasty things and still will. Like, there's no doubt that that's still going to happen. But the mainstream will gradually be shut off to anybody with a contrary point of view, and the speech in those settings will be controlled, regardless of whether you're on the server that you're talking into is Canadian or American or somewhere else. Because the question is the cost of doing business in Canada for these companies.
Who else had a question? Yeah.
So do you think the prosecution of the or the implementation of this bill can it be retroactive, like for things that we have said in the past? Can that be used against any individual, like once this has been enacted?
So that's a really good question. It's a legal question. If a criminal law can't be, the charter says that a criminal law cannot apply retroactively or retrospectively to conduct that happened in the past. However, Section 13 of the Human Rights Act isn't a criminal law, so it could, constitutionally, in theory, it could apply retrospectively. The law doesn't do that. The law doesn't say that it does. But if they were to amend it to say it applies to something you said in the past, then that's constitutionally possible. I'm not saying it's happening. I'm not saying it will happen necessarily, but could it? Yeah, it could, and that's a real worry.
That's scary.
Question?
So, could this legislation effectively shut down, say, Rebel News or any of the other alternative news if they keep publishing stories that the government doesn't want published?
It depends what the stories are and if they can be characterized as hate speech. But potentially, yes. If it's characterized in that way, if they quote unquote vilify somebody, then they could be fined. They could be asked to remove their own story, correct their own story. It certainly came very close to happening to Maclean's Magazine and to the Western Standard. And Ezra Levant ran the Western Standard. He runs Rebel News now. So yeah, if he published Mohammed cartoons, for example, that could happen.
Oh,
Get a microphone to you.
So what do you define hate speech as? Could it be against the government? If you said something like Ezra Levant is always talking about, like Rebel News is always speaking about the Liberals, like Trudeau in particular. So
They talk about hate speech that is likely to foment detestation or vilification of an individual. So that could be any individual in theory, or a group of individuals on the basis of a prohibited ground of discrimination. And there's a list of prohibited grounds. I don't have it in front of me right now, but it includes obviously race, religion, national and ethnic origin, sexual orientation, gender, and at least in the Provincial Human Rights Act, political belief and political affiliation is on there. So yes, if you vilified liberals, in theory that is something that could be caught by this. Or if you vilified conservatives, I don't think that conservatives would use it in that way. But you never know. And if a conservative government comes in and puts in a policy that people find overbearing, liberal and conservative oriented politicians have been known to practice tyranny in the past. So I think it's a really scary road to go down when political censorship, regardless of which side you're on, because it could always be used against you. And I think Jaymee mentioned something when we were chatting earlier over dinner. She said this can flip on a dime. Something that could be considered acceptable speech or even socially positive speech now could be completely unacceptable a few years in the future. An example I use of that is in 1967, I believe it was. There was a challenge of some sort to the law in Canada against homosexuality. It was criminal at the time. And there was a 5-4 decision of the Supreme Court of Canada. And the majority, 5 of them, said that homosexuality was obviously so contrary to social values and so contrary to the norm that it was simply wrong to allow it, and that it had to remain prohibited, had to remain illegal. Those 5 justices, 5 of the most powerful people in Canada in 1967, if you printed their words on the internet in 2024 under this legislation, you could be charged with hate speech. So the highest court in the land, you come back to it 50 some odd years later, is committing hate speech by today's standards. So nobody today is going to be immune from, no view today is going to be immune from prosecution 50 years from now. It's not guaranteed. So whatever side you're on, whatever you believe, you got to be concerned about this. So wouldn't you agree with that, Jaymee?
Yeah, definitions can change over time and with culture and in location or with, you know what I mean? Like there's just different factors and they're not static, they're dynamic. So to try and write a law that's going to hold over time and culture and place in different age groups and stuff, it's just, it's always going to be changing and it's always going to be arbitrary depending on whoever's defining it, which in this case is going to be, you know, the people writing the laws are going to always, of course, make it so it can't be, they can be used against them. Mm-hmm. Like it's just a setup for a power and control dynamic that is ever changing and you can never quite define.
Yeah, and I could see a conservative government using this very differently than a liberal government, and just look at the politics in the United States as well, how polarized it is. When you look at, for example, before the 2016 election, when there was some talk of criminally prosecuting Hillary Clinton, and the Democrats said, that's against our constitutional norms. We can't threaten to criminalize the opposing presidential candidate. Well, look what's happening now. Look what's happening in 2024. The Democrats are criminally prosecuting the opposing political candidate. So it can flip in 8 years, let alone 50 years.
Now, even though a lot of people think they have nothing left to vote for other than Trump and maybe Kennedy. So, you know, if you look at his record and put him in California when there was the 3-strike thing, he was out a long time ago without mentioning his name.
Sure. Well, I'm not here to defend or promote any particular candidate, except to say that both sides of this of the coin, liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican, they play the same game, and there's a lot of hypocrites. And the more hypocritical you are, the higher in power you can rise. So that's a real concern.
Do you think that they may use this law to go to like a hearsay type of situation and not just the internet, expand it to, oh, so-and-so overheard you say to your friend in confidence about X, Y, Z?
Yes, and this particular law applies to the internet, Section 13 of the Human Rights Act, or the internet and other, and any other means of telecommunication. So yeah, it could be a two-way conversation where somebody says something that really, really offends you, and then you go and report them to the Human Rights Commissioner. That's possible under this law. I'm only aware of one case where it happened, and it was a First Nations chief named David Ahenekue in Manitoba, and he was talking to a reporter. He gave kind of a fiery speech, a little bit disorganized, where he said some things about Israel. And afterwards, a reporter came up to him and started saying, what do you think about the Jews? What do you think about the Jews? And at first he kept saying, I don't want to talk about the Jews. And after about 5 attempts, he just exploded, and he said some absolutely horrendous anti-Semitic things that I'm not going to repeat here. But he did not know that he was being tape recorded. He believed that he was having a private conversation with an annoying reporter who was pushing him and pushing his buttons. And he got criminally charged, which is different from the civil hate speech provisions, because under the criminal hate speech provisions, it says other than in private conversation. It is really interesting, though, that this law does not have that exception, other than in private conversation. So David Ahenekue was acquitted because ultimately the court found that he did not intend to promote hatred. He did not know that he was being recorded. But under this piece of legislation, in theory, a person who didn't know that they were being recorded, who was having a private telephone call with one other individual who was recording it, could technically be found to be in breach. So that's a good point, and something I hadn't thought about, but something I would really worry about with the way that this is worded.
I kind of think there's also maybe the potential for things to, you have to prove yourself that you didn't say something, because now with like deep fakes or people being able to cut and splice things on the internet, or like, you know, like things that would actually be considered evidence, you know, or being a little clip taken out of a context or something, right? Like it'd be really easy to take a little snippet of something somebody said and take it out of context and then have that recorded, and then, you know, it would be really difficult for somebody to have to, you know, prove that they weren't being hateful. You know, I think I could see it really slipping the other way, where it's very easy to kind of make anything seem hateful with the right editing, you know?
Yeah, and that's a good point with this law as well, because under the criminal code hate speech provisions that David Henneque and others have been charged under, there's a proof beyond a reasonable doubt standard. You have to prove that it really was them, that they really did say these things, which if there's a recording that's on a tape recorder in 20 years ago, you can probably prove quite easily continuity of that. But on the internet today, maybe not, because things can very easily be digitally manipulated. And this piece of legislation, the Human Rights Act, is only requires proof on the balance of probabilities. So you don't have to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. You have to prove guilt that more probably guilty than not. So 50% plus 1. And if somebody says this person said this thing on an online chat service or whatever, and here's a recording, and the person says, no, I didn't say that thing, the Human Rights Commission could say, well, we don't believe you. We think you probably said it. 50% plus 1, you're guilty. And yeah, so there's a real concern there. Any other questions or thoughts? Okay, well, thank you, everybody, for giving us such a warm reception, for coming out and spending your evening this way. It's so good to see people who are so engaged and interested. And again, I hope that as many of you as are interested and agree with what we've had to say here or have questions, that you can sign this letter to the opposition members of the Justice and Human Rights Committee. There's a lot of copies of the letter up here, so if you want to take a couple of them with you to give to friends or family and bring back signed copies next week, you're more than welcome to do that. If you want to see more of these kinds of presentations, we have, Jaymee and I have a YouTube channel called The Corruption Files, and if you want to search Corruption Files along with my name, Jaymee Maddock, on YouTube, you can do that. Jaymee has a lot of content on YouTube and other channels, Rumble, I believe. Do you want to shout out anything of yours, Jaymee?
No, I'm actually not that easy to find, but if you Google my name, there's all kinds of stuff that'll come up if you want to find me.
So
but there's not one spot you can locate it all.
Lots of interesting stuff and a huge variety of stuff. So feel free to look into that. And of course, we thank We Unify for hosting this presentation tonight. I've been part of We Unify since 2021, so almost 3 years now. And they've done an amazing job of creating all kinds of events. And of course, the Reclaiming Canada Conference coming up, which I'm sure there will be some information about in the description of this video for those of you watching online. So thank you again, everybody, and have a wonderful evening.
That 9/11 ending.